In the second part of our inquiry into drugs and the creative process, we'll see drugs no longer remaining an exotic speciality for artistic and aristocratic elites, but reaching a new and wider public. A drug tested by artistic cliques in the 19th century, cannabis, also known as marijuana, bush, dope, grass, blow, and so on, is on the verge of a popular breakout. Bebop Bebop, the product of the black jazz scene in 1940s America, reached out to an audience beyond the ghetto. Drugs crossed the racial divide and sparked off a chain of developments that would eventually dominate much of the art and drug scene of the next 30 years.
One key factor in the spread of marijuana northwards, away from New Orleans, was the closing down of the red light district in Storyville during the First World War, when the American Navy were rather disturbed about the numbers of sailors who were going to see prostitutes and taking drugs and gambling. And so there were fewer opportunities for the jazz musicians who were there to play, and they began to look for other possibilities for work.
Jazz was the music of exiles. And for the disaffected whites roaming post-war America, jazz clubs were a place to meet like minds and to absorb the hip exoticism of black music. Among those particularly entranced were the writer Jack Kerouac, author of the seminal On the Road, and his constant traveling companion, Neal Cassady.
On the Road is a picaresque novel that Kerouac wrote about his adventures with Neal Cassady. They went back and forth from New York to New Orleans to Chicago to Los Angeles to San Francisco, and this was a sort of plotless book, but a book that incorporated all sorts of mythic elements.
Carolyn Cassady was Neal's wife, and for a period in the 50s, she was also Jack Kerouac's lover.
After the very first time Neal went to get Jack, and on the first trip, and that he describes it On the Road, I, of course, said, "Don't darken my door again," and most of the trips were like that I'd thrown them out, and so then they took the trip. And then Neal would come back and plead and plead and plead, and something bizarre always happened. Either I was pregnant again, impossible though it was, or the welfare said there's no need, or something strange would happen. So I'd have to take him back to take care of the children while I worked, or he worked, or something, just to support us. But I was still always the Puritan figure that well, part of it may have been their Catholic guilt or whatever, because I dutifully punished Neal every time I could, and so he was free to go do it again.
Well, Kerouac wanted to write like a jazz musician. He was someone who loved jazz. Jazz was the most exciting music that he had ever heard, although he loved all kinds of music. But basically, it was the bobsters' freedom, their spontaneity, their sense of breaking the forms, playing for each other, a jazz that was for artists, not for dancers.
The passage in On the Road where they're looking for it, capital I, capital T, that sense they're looking for some outside the normal range of experience is the basis of the book. And in order to get that range, in order to get that something different, something outside the sets, yes, then they were on a whole range of drugs.
Neal was on speed much of the time, and Jack used it to help him write in long and broken runs of many pages. This unique flow of Kerouac's prose seems to owe a lot both to drugs that sensitize like marijuana and drugs like Benzedrine that accelerate the pace of life.
No, the novel Dr. Sax, which is exquisite prose, I think reflects the fact that he wrote it almost entirely on marijuana. The more speedy writing of The Subterraneans and a few other later works, I think, reflects the Benzedrine that he took, amphetamines, which were not very good for him, actually. I didn't find amphetamine very good for writing at all. But Kerouac had that physical strength that he could sit down and write a novel in several days or several weeks. But then he had to rest afterward.
Dean was already racing across the street with his thumb in the air, yelling, "Blow, man, blow!" The behatted tenor man was blowing at the peak of a wonderfully satisfactory free idea. A rising and falling riff that went from E-ya to a crazier E-D-E-ya, and blasted along to the rolling crash of butt-scarred drums hammered by a big, brutal Negro with a bull neck who didn't give a damn about anything but punishing his busted tubs. Crash, rattle-to-boom, crash. Uproars of music, and the tenor man had it, and everyone knew he had it.
The term beat generation suggests a coherent movement with its own special slot in history. It's largely a journalistic invention to cover a period of American bohemianism when writers such as Kerouac and William Burroughs and poets like Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti came to prominence for the way they voiced and acted out their dissatisfaction with the American way of life.
The original conception that was called Beat Generation was a group of friends who were interested in examining the texture of consciousness. And so there was some interest in drugs as far back as 1949, particularly marijuana, because that had made a slight change in sensitivity and awareness, and also a deconstruction of the authority of the government, which had hyperbolic and ridiculous stories about marijuana. But we all got together by 1955 in San Francisco in what was called the San Francisco Literary Renaissance. And that was very definitely Buddhist-oriented, and a little grass and a little peyote and a little whatever on the side.
Plenty of writers and painters take drugs and then use the experience as subject matter in their work. But it doesn't necessarily follow that the form of their work is changed. In examining the connection between drugs and the creative process, one needs, therefore, to look at both. In Laughing Gas, a poem about nitrous oxide, Allen Ginsberg experiments with the fundamental elements of poetic form, like line length, page layout, the use of capitals, and the mixing of conversational tone with the philosophical.
I had a dentist cousin to whom I went in the late 50s to get my teeth fixed, and he was cooperative, so I took a notebook into the dentist chair, and he'd give me the mask and observe while he put me out and brought me back to consciousness again. Stepping outside the universe by means of nitrous oxide, anesthetizing mind consciousness, the chiliasm was an impersonal dream, one of many, being mere dreams. The sadness of birth and death, the sadness of changing from dream to dream, the constant farewell of forms, saying goodbye to what doesn't exist, the many worlds that don't exist, all which seem real, all joke, all lost cartoon. That's why Satori is accompanied by laughter, and the Zen master rips up the sutras in fury. Relax and die. The process will repeat itself. Be born, back to the same old smiling dentist.
The issue was quite explicitly to do with breaking down early training, in his case, as a Jewish intellectual from a very strict upbringing. His father, particularly, was also a poet. And his training in pretty formal poetics. There's a sense, right from the beginning, of breaking the sets. Breaking, as the phrase has it in those days particularly, and finding how to do it very quickly through some kind of drug intake.
Did either the combination of meditation and drugs, or even drugs, deliver anything of use? Yes, I would say definitely, artistically. Part 2 of the poem Howl, written by me, which is the best known poem that I've written, was written under the influence of peyote, as a kind of peyote vision of the urban megalopolis, something like Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And the poem Whale's Visitation was quite good as a conjunction of a mystical vision or an LSD vision and an ordinary mind, specific detailed observations of lamb hair hung, gossamer, rain beaded on the grass. That sort of microscopic observation of detail, which is the minute particulars, as Blake calls them. I think the new American poetry of open form after William Carlos Williams and Ezra Pound, from mid-century on, I'd say almost all the poets that I'm interested in, from Gary Snyder to Frank O'Hara, they've all had some experience with grass.
Paul Bowles, author of The Sheltering Sky, was born in New York, yet spent his early life studying and traveling in Europe. He was intermittently acquainted with the beat writers, but his work is philosophically and stylistically very different. In 1948, he was encouraged by Alice B. Toklas to settle in Tangier, where the North African cannabis culture was long established. Keef, as the drug is called there, was smoked as a matter of course.
If you live here in Morocco, surrounded by Moroccans, friends, all of whom will smoke, and all smokers love to discuss it. They talk about everything, how to get the better plant, what to do with it, how long it should be cured, the whole business. It's big technical problems come up. They argue, and of course you listen if you're a writer, and you learn a good deal about how they feel about it. And when you smoke with them, you learn how it changes them, then it's very likely to change you in the same way. But you cease thinking of it as an exotic pastime. I could only, after profound thought, be able to say exactly in what way, say, smoking Keef influenced my literary style or literary thought. That's more like it. The style has nothing to do with it. It's what's chosen to be written about and what is cut out. The following scene, which I'm going to read from the novel Let It Come Down, shows the hero who has been fed some cannabis paste by his hostess. It shows him reacting to the drug and not wanting to confess that he feels it. I'd like to be saying good night right now, he thought. Everything he took the trouble to look at carefully seemed to be bristling with an intense but undecipherable meaning. Daisy's face with its halo of white pillows, the light pouring over the array of bottles on the table, the glistening black floor and the irregular black and white stripes on the skins at his feet, the darker and more distant parts of the room by the windows where the motionless curtains almost touched the floor. Each thing was uttering a wordless but vital message, which was a key, a symbol, but which there was no hope of seizing or understanding. And inside himself, now that he became conscious of it, in his chest more than anywhere else, there was a tremendous trembling pressure, as though he were about to explode. He breathed in various ways to see if he could change it. And then he realized that his heart was beating too fast. Ah, hell, he said aloud, because he was suddenly frightened. Well, it's very difficult for me to be precise about methods of work because I don't really have any. Generally, even when I start writing a novel, I don't know what I'm going to write. And often I don't know what I've written when I finish. That doesn't matter. I never change. I never rewrite. The first draft is the final draft, which goes off to the publisher. I remember being afraid to write the story of the death of Port in The Sheltering Sky because I'd never written about death. and I didn't know how to treat it. I thought it needs to be treated with a certain gravity. So I didn't write the scene until one day in Tangier, up on the mountain, I ate some majoon in the early afternoon. It took it a while to come on, and then I began imagining the details that had to do with a kind of vision of Ports before he died. And the next morning, transcribed everything that I had experienced down to the last detail, because I remembered it all, as one remembers a particularly vivid dream.
Shortly after Paul Bowles settled in Tangier, another American writer, William Burroughs, was drawn to the city. It provided a cosmopolitan haven for a colony of artists and bohemians who appreciated the city's relaxed attitude to drugs and gay sex. If America seemed to the beat writers to have lost its way, for others it had become harsh and threatening. To resist this threat, harder drugs were needed. The most notorious and addictive of which was heroin. The Naked Lunch by William Burroughs is one of the most remarkable novels of the 20th century. It is both violently ugly and has an irresistible power. Depending on which side of the fence the reader falls, the novel is either a brutally honest account of the moral vacuity and subsequent bestiality of much of humankind, or it's a shameless excuse for some of the most lurid and repellent scenes of homoeroticism, drug addiction, and generally deviant behavior ever committed to prose.
They gibber and squeal at the sight of it. The spit hangs off their chin and their stomach rumbles and all their guts grind in peristalsis while they cook up, dissolving the body's decent skin. You expect any moment a great blob of protoplasm will flop right out and surround the junk. Really disgusts you to see it.
In a letter to his one-time lover, Allen Ginsberg, Burroughs declared, "I'm trying to create something that will have a life of its own, that can put me in real danger, a danger which I willingly take on myself." He told Kerouac, "I'm shitting out my educated Middle West background for once and for all. It's a matter of catharsis where I say the most horrible things I can think of."
I think it's a remarkable achievement. On one level, a comic masterpiece. But it's also a kind of apocalyptic view of the post-war world, full of cruelty, full of sensation, governed by a series of huge media conspiracies.
The Naked Lunch is a satire. Now, what's the point there? The point is that its targets, which I've already described, are those who control, manipulate, and waste, and those who submit. I mean, the power structure is a two-way thing. Those who submit, those who dominate. Now, that is the central thematic area of Burroughs' work. And addiction can be addiction to submission as well as addiction to control.
There's no architecture to his novels. I think this may be something that was determined by the sort of present tense experience of hardcore addiction.
What would be specific to heroin or to that experience, I would say, is the experience, which is a very modern one, of the trash body. The body as something that is excremental, that is corruptible in its mutability, that isn't somehow idealized or is not, let's say, subservient to a notion of spirit or any sort of superior consciousness.
And there's a very important passage he actually wrote in a journal brought out in San Francisco called the Journal for the Protection of All Beings. This is 1961. Junk is the mold of monopoly and possession, the ultimate merchandise. No sales talk is necessary. The client will crawl through a sewer and beg to buy. The junk merchant does not sell his product to the consumer. He sells the consumer to the product. He degrades and simplifies the client. Junk yields the basic formula of evil virus.
Heroin causes a reduction in anxiety and a cutting off of the individual from the outside world. So someone on heroin over a long period of time will tend to neglect the outside world. They'll use their money to buy the drug and not to buy food, clothing, or necessarily provide a home for themselves. So the whole lifestyle associated with the drug becomes considerably more important than the pharmacological effects of the drug on the brain itself.
In 1964, the American writer Hubert Selby Jr. published his notorious novel Last Exit to Brooklyn, and quickly became embroiled in a lengthy obscenity trial in Great Britain. The book was a violent and unsentimental account of the lives of transvestites, junkies, prostitutes and criminals in New York. It was initially declared obscene and only cleared after an appeal.
I had a personal, emotional kind of crisis in my life, and I ran into an old friend of mine from the neighborhood in Brooklyn who had gone to prison while I went to sea, and after a few years we hooked up, and he was a heroin addict at the time. And so I got my first taste of heroin there, and it was an instant love affair. Now, my total obsession for 6 years was writing Last Exit. It totally consumed me. Every night I'd come home after work and I'd write this book. And when I finally finished, then it's suddenly like your child leaving home or your family dying. These people have deserted me, so to speak, and I'm left with this terrible anguish and empty hole in my gut. And once again, I met this old friend.
According to some clinical and psychoanalytical definitions, the addict is the non-renouncer, which is to say, as Freud said, the addict doesn't know how to mourn, can't get rid of anything.
Writing Last Exit, and for me, art, can be very much like a drug, in that it momentarily and temporarily fills a craving need in my life. And then when it's taken away, I'm left with that same problem that I think is being solved by writing, by heroin, but in fact, it's still there.
Writers influenced by heroin, such as Burroughs and Selby, had some subject matter in common, but wrote in very different styles. It seems that a typical heroin style might therefore be quite hard to find. Perhaps our stereotype of the heroin addict misleads us into presuming a similarity. An addicted writer who brought a haunting poetry to her work, as well as expressing most convincingly an inner world shaped by a particular chemical, was Anna Kavan.
I suppose you would say that most of Anna Kavan's writing is a response to her isolation, her feelings of isolation, which were annulled by, and yet at the same time emphasized by, her use of the drug.
For a moment, my lights picked out like searchlights the girl's naked body, slight as a child's, ivory white against the dead white of the snow, her hair bright as spun glass. She did not look in my direction. Motionless, she kept her eyes fixed on the walls, moving slowly towards her, a glassy, glittering circle of solid ice, of which she was the center. Dazzling flashes came from the ice cliffs far over her head. Below, the outermost fringes of ice had already reached her, immobilized her, set hard as concrete over her feet and ankles. I watched the ice climb higher, covering knees and thighs, saw her mouth open, a black hole in the white face, heard her thin, agonized scream.
Wouldn't seem to shut down expressive power so much as narrow the emotional and psychological range of the artist. And where heroin was cold and constricting, The new man-made drugs of the 50s dissolved inner resistances and presented the user with hotly alluring vistas. The pleasure-seeking and the spiritual tendencies were about to fuse under the mighty impact of the most psychedelic chemical yet to be made by man. It was called LSD, more commonly known as acid. It was an awesomely potent chemical that could escort the user to the ultimate banquet of the senses, or deposit him in the lap of God for an 8-hour audience. Dr. Oscar Janiger was a psychiatrist who administered LSD to film stars and artists in the late 50s.
We took a number of people from all walks of life and gave them a standard dose of the substance, and we recorded their experiences. In the course of these experiments, it was one of our subjects was an artist, and under the drug, he said he must have something to paint. And on the mantle there was a Kachina doll that I had simply as an ornament. I took it down and said, "Okay, go ahead, paint this," which he did. And that thing was fortuitous because it looked somewhat human, and it also was colorful and it had a mythic quality about it, so it made an ideal subject. And when he was through and he came out of it, he said, "This is astonishing, this is remarkable." He said, "I must have some other painters do this." And we built a special room that looked like a studio, that was a studio, and had an easel and had good light. And we just began to process the artists. And they had only one requirement. They had to paint the reference object, which was the doll. They used all the available space. The image would swell up to fill the space. In certain instances, they would leave the canvas, or if they had this painted picture on the wall or whatever they were doing, they'd go off into the wall and they'd extend their arena. That was one. The second was they used more color than they ordinarily would. They very great vibrancy, a lot of color, and a lot of movement. The artist was able to, that is the graphic or visual artist, was able to make an intrinsic statement about what he saw. And that was very important because what you got was a global appreciation of the shift in his perception. I have to say that writers were disappointing because they're all thinking about it. It's in their head, and you didn't see very much. In the case of Anais, for example, she became emotional somewhat, and a bit tearful, but no one could have the slightest idea what was going on in that wonderful mind of hers.
On the plain surface of the door, there now appeared the most delicate Persian designs. Flowers, mandalas, patterns in perfect symmetry. As I designed them, they produced their matching music. When I drew a long orange line, it emitted its own orange tone. There was perfect connection between my body and everything that was happening.
What conclusions do you draw from all this?
The secret of life is breath. That's what I always wanted words to do, to breathe.
In essence, what did you feel was going on?
I felt that the chemical shut out the quotidian world as an interference and left you alone with your dreams and fantasies and memories. In this way, it made it easier to gain access to the subconscious life, which is also accessible to the artist by way of art.
Now, the effects of LSD are to disrupt the functioning of the serotonin chemical messenger in the brain, so that the brain cells don't communicate in a normal way, and the messages which are being transmitted are distorted. Now, this causes particular problems with sensory messages and produces these misinterpretations, these illusions, these hallucinations, which are so characteristic of the LSD experience. But there's another phenomenon, I think, which people find quite interesting, which is the so-called flashback, which can be days or weeks later. Some of the LSD experiences are relived.
Such is the power of the LSD experience that users often feel that they've left their bodies. Returning to Earth, their user feels that they've been away, taking a trip. These departures and re-entries required a degree of skill, an art of tripping. As yet, no one had presumed to write a pilot's manual, but that was soon to change. A man called Michael Hollingshead, on advice from Huxley, gave LSD to the psilocybin researcher Timothy Leary, who immediately felt compelled to spread the word. Leary became the charismatic leader of the LSD explosion.
It's amusing to me that now in the 90s, they're talking about the return of the 60s in terms of fashion and clothing and decoration and body paint. The thing about the brain experience, which we'll call it the acid experience or the visionary experience, it tends to make artists out of everybody. The way you dress, you let your hair grow long, you start making things more colorful. Now, you ask me, can it make you creative? I have to distinguish between the experience. You're having an absolutely new experience. The question is, can you communicate it? And that's where the artistry comes. Now, throughout human history, the greatest artists have tried to share this experience. Mystics, including our friends from Coleridge in England, all that, they've always described this experience in terms of optical stuff. Illumination, enlightenment, revelation, insight, doors to perception. It's basically the eyeballs are the windows of the brain. You open up, dilate those eyeballs to have this creative experience.
However, some of the major players in the LSD story made a convincing case for living life itself as an art. Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is a prime example. Cuckoo's Nest and Sometimes a Great Notion were later made into movies, and Kesey looked all set to move along the channels specially reserved for potential great American writer. Along came LSD, still viewed by many as the creativity drug. Kesey, the writer, dropped a great deal of acid, yet he took a novel turn rather than turn out another novel. This is how he saw it.
After 2 successful novels and 10 times 2 successful fantasies, I find myself wondering what to prove next. I've shown the buggers I can write, then shown them I can repeat and better the first showing. Now what do I prove? The answer seems to be, prove nothing.
Both of them produced kind of multimedia shows. Leary had one that he toured around and did experiences with. One was, I think, called The Death of the Buddha. And Kesey, of course, had the acid tests. But the main thing is that it never materialized. There was a great feeling that there was some creative breakthrough that the drug was going to energize into a new type of art, but it never happened. I think this is one of the, the visionary potentials are so great. And, in an instant, 10 novels can occur to you. Wonderful novels. And that's very different than sitting down and then spending the year writing those novels. They saw potentials that they were never able to realize. And then, of course, society was turning against them in such a dramatic way that, pretty soon they didn't have the luxury to worry about creating a new art form. They rather had to worry about staying out of jail.
A lot of the excitement of the 60s was captured by the painters and sculptors who produced pop art. Their wholehearted embrace of the popular and trashy in our culture redefined what was proper subject matter for art. The suggestion that there was beauty in the banal might have been inspired by contact with drugs. We shall turn to one of the major figures of the period for specialist insight into the issue. Mr. Warhol, throughout the 60s and 70s, much of your work was carried out by a large team of assistants in the New York studio called The Factory. Were drugs a significant part of the artistic life there?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Did you take drugs yourself?
No.
But there was drug taking among your assistants?
Well, yeah.
Were you ever concerned that their habits might obscure the message of your work?
Message. Gee. No.
Thank you, Mr. Warhol.
You're welcome.
Perhaps the impact of these drugs on a visual sensibility only serves to intensify what was already a matter of priority, whereas writers are plunged into worlds of imagery that depart much more radically from their expectations. A British author, touched momentarily by the acid wave, was the science fiction writer J.G. Ballard.
Taking LSD was probably one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made in my life. I was expecting a sort of a visual funfair, a sort of a roller coaster. In fact, I had an experience lasting about 10 hours that was the nearest I've ever known to a psychotic experience, and one that lasted many years, when just for a few seconds, a year or 2 years later, a little vent of hell would open and I'd get this shiver of pure paranoia. One's perception of time is profoundly altered by LSD. Whether that's necessarily an aid to the imagination, I don't know. I think if the experience had any value for me, I think it's that it simply gave my imagination another piece of material to work upon. But I think the imagination, unfettered, coupled with a powerful sense of the world as it is a far more powerful tool for the writer or artist than any chemical crutch.
I mean, in some sense, what these substances do is they give you the visionary hit. And and that is sort of what leads you on through the drudgery, through the pain, through the not making any money, living on a margin of a society that in many ways scorns you as an artist. It's the visionary hit that leads you on. And I think drugs have oftentimes brought them into why they want to be artists in the first place. But it also mitigates, if they lean on them too hard, into actually doing the work, because unfortunately, art is about doing the work. It's not just having the vision. It's then being able to translate it into this consciousness.
Given that LSD frequently made the real world seem transparent or meaningless, an artist's post-acid insights might genuinely be hard to express. All the normal points of reference would have suddenly become obsolete. As Kesey intimated, it might encourage one to make life an art rather than art from life. In 1932, the Benzedrine inhaler became available to the American public on the open market. Cracking a Benny involved splitting open the inhaler's plastic casing and swallowing the cotton wool packed inside. By the 1960s, amphetamine abuse was widespread in North America and Europe. Doctors overprescribed it, and many varieties of the drug were available in pill form on the street. Philip K. Dick was one of the most revered science fiction writers of the 60s and 70s. He was extremely prolific, and in 1963 won the Hugo Award for The Man in the High Castle. He also wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?, on which the film Blade Runner was based. And Dick's novels appealed strongly to the psychedelic sensibility of the time. He was seen as a tripped-out seer, at home in parallel realities and time-warped worlds. And Dick had tried LSD a few times, but few of his fans were aware that he was, in fact, heavily addicted to amphetamines.
Philip K. Dick's full flight of drug use, so to speak, came in the 60s and very early 70s, during which time he was in a different marital situation. He had a family to support. These were factors that he would point to as leading to a pressure to take speed to produce novels at a rather frantic pace that he did write.
Running through all of Philip K. Dick's fiction, really, is a sense of someone besieged, many characters besieged, threats coming from all directions, often unexpectedly.
He would stay up, he would pull all-nighters, he would sometimes pull all-nighters in succession in an attempt to burn through his books. He liked writing his books in fast and furious drafts.
The amphetamines have a wide range of effects, but they fall into the group of so-called sympathetic amines. That is, they produce a general increase in the functioning of the body, a rise in pulse rate, increase in respiration, sweating. They speed up most brain processes. They speed up memory, they speed up feelings of emotion, they speed up the ability to do repetitive tasks. And in particular, they prevent the person from becoming tired.
Probably his greatest flights of fantasy and imagination were fueled or flavored just a bit by that amphetamine rush, and it also made him perhaps sometimes careless or hectic. Some people complain about the sloppiness in certain of his books. You might attribute a bit of it to that.
But you can't help grieving when you read some of the novels and thinking they're brilliant, but there's a built-in expendability about them.
There are a number of his novels in which reality transformations, consciousness transformations, viewpoints of the individual within the future society they're living in are based upon drug ingestion, transformations through drugs.
In 1973, Phil Dick wrote a novel called A Scanner Darkly. It registers his disgust at the 1960s drug scene in California. What an undercover narcotics agent fears most is not that he will be shot or beaten up, but that he will be slipped a great hit of some psychedelic that will roll an endless horror feature film in his head for the remainder of his life. Or that he will be shot with a Mex hit, half heroin and half substance D. Or both of the above, plus a poison such as strychnine, which will kill him nearly, but not completely, so that the above can occur. Lifelong addiction, lifelong horror film.
I submit that any reader who reads Philip K. Dick's novels without using the science fiction genre as a delimiting blinder will find that this is a remarkable writer with a vision and intensity and a viewpoint on modern fragmented life that you won't find anywhere else.
In 50s France, amphetamine, or speed, was available over the counter in the form of a drug called Coridrain, and students, intellectuals, artists held it in high regard, believing that it made the mind sharper, more agile and more lucid. Among its keen adherents was the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre.
It was intended to increase his output, make him work more effectively, produce more during the day. And he should have taken 1 or 2 tablets at breakfast time and 1 or 2 at midday, instead of which he soon got up to about 20. And there was a very strong self-destructive force behind this. I do think that the use of drugs encouraged Sartre to rebel against the traditions of good writing. He wanted to be different. He was interested primarily in swinging society leftwards. And the kind of blurring that amphetamines produced in his mind encouraged him to disregard all the rules and traditions of French literature. On the other hand, in the writing that he regarded as most creative, which is to say fiction or drama, he didn't use drugs at all. So clearly he regarded drugs as something that were dangerous to his creativity.
Now, hardly anyone views speed as a creativity drug. Speed, for some artists, such as Philip K. Dick, it was a tool for intensifying work rate, a tool whose depressing after effects could be dangerously suppressed with yet more speed.
At his peak in the late 60s, early 70s, by his own testimony, he was taking 1,000 amphetamines a week. White Crosses and whatever speed street drugs he was taking. And the testimony of a roommate who I interviewed was that he would go to the refrigerator, in which was a large jar of White Crosses, and simply dip his hand in, take a handful, and swallow them. So if you ask how he fared with all this, the answer was badly.
There was within Philip K. Dick a tremendous sense of guilt and loss that must have turned him on to drugs. You see, he was born a twin. He had a twin sister called Jean, and throughout his life, Dick was haunted by the death of this sister. It's no wonder that Dick, throughout his life, imagined a lot of alternative worlds in which, at least in his head, that lost sister could live again.
Now, cocaine isn't chemically related to the amphetamines, yet like them, it gives the user feelings of power and elation. And because of this, and because it was also fairly expensive, cocaine became known as the drug of the 80s. Now, cocaine was associated with glamorous showbiz lifestyles and Jack the Lad futures brokers, and the conspicuous greed of the Thatcher and Reagan years, a profile that might seem to make it less attractive to artists.
Just in terms of sheer volume, there must have been some good art produced by people under the influence of cocaine. It must have happened. It certainly supplies you with a great deal of energy, so you can do a lot of sustained work. It keeps you from wandering off. It keeps you from going off and getting something to eat. It does concentrate the mind. But as soon as you stand up and you go from the piece that you're working on and out into your life, you find that life has become very difficult because you're crazy. And you very often people who are doing cocaine will turn to the cocaine when they feel that they're uncomfortable with the state of their mind. They try and get everything under control by doing more cocaine, which of course makes them crazier. And the thing is solipsistic, it's entirely about itself.
When cocaine is taken, it produces a rapid euphoria, a feeling of increased mental and physical capacity, but it also produces peripheral symptoms like an increased heart rate and palpitations. If cocaine is taken regularly and in large doses, it may produce, instead of euphoria, effects such as irritability, anxiety, paranoia, and sometimes frank psychosis.
Cocaine tends to make writers verbose and prolix. When I think of a cocaine style, I tend to think of a style that's overloaded and frantic, and of pieces that are too long. So I hope cocaine hasn't influenced my work at all.
Throughout the 70s, though, it had been the gourmet drug of rock musicians and people with money to burn. And there were some artists who wished to celebrate the nihilism of the times rather than be engulfed by it. Jay McInerney was one of those who captured this hedonistic mania in his novel Bright Lights, Big City, published in 1984. Cocaine appears as Bolivian marching powder, a reference to its use by soldiers in its country of origin.
In the bathroom, there are no doors on the stalls, which makes it tough to be discreet. But clearly, you are not the only person in here to take on fuel. Lots of sniffling going on in the stalls. The windows are blacked over, and for this you are profoundly grateful. Up, 2, 3, 4. The soldiers are back on their feet. They are off and running in formation. Some of them are dancing, and you must follow their example. Just outside the door, you spot her, tall, dark, and alone, half hidden behind a pillar at the edge of the dance floor. You approach laterally, moving your stuff like a bad spade through the slalom of a synthesized conga rhythm. Dance? I do not speak English, she says. Why is she looking at you that way, as if tarantulas were nesting in your eye sockets? You are, by any chance, from Bolivia?
Even as we speak, somebody, somewhere out there, is sure to be trying out the designer drug of the moment. Known to the pharmacologists as MDMA, and on the street as ecstasy. Its widespread use today suggests that designer or function-specific chemicals will be the drugs of the future. Among the new substances emerging are smart drugs, which it's claimed enhance intelligence, memory, and powers of concentration. Leading-edge computer artists have already asserted that smart drugs are a positive aid to programming. Virtual reality, one of the ultimate expressions of computer programming, represents a fusion of an art experience with a drug experience. It's seen by some as a new and exciting art form, and by others as a kind of legalized psychedelic. The heightened enveloping sensation that it brings is not out there, like a painting, but inside your head, like a drug. Drugs and art may be intimately linked because they both involve flights of the imagination. Artists, therefore, are drawn to drugs as they are to art. It's in their nature. Drugs could provide a renewal of vision or a spur through the hard times. But we also know that the use of drugs can dissipate quality, reduce output, even shorten lives. A few artists take drugs to reduce their sensitivity, or to slow down or speed up the mind. For many, drugs are simply a key to dreams, a means of exploring the texture of consciousness. And there are many artists who see drugs as a way to break convention, to loosen the shackles of rational socialized thought, to free themselves, to fly.
Because you're crazy.
Visionary hit. Chemical crunch.
Illumination.
A craving need.
The trash body.
Texture of consciousness.
The switchman in the mind.
Opium had the most intelligent smell.
Save your dream.
Shock the bourgeoisie.
Confines of the universe.